More. Global Imports. Headquarters. Manhattan, New York. The glass towers of Manhattan shimmered under the late morning sun, their steel edges slicing through a pale blue sky. Inside the 32nd floor of More Global Imports, chaos ruled. Papers shuffled, voices tangled, and the air was tense with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and panic. At the head of the long mahogany table, Jackson Moore sat like a king whose patience had worn thin. His tailored charcoal suit clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, and the Rolex on his wrist gleamed as he drummed his fingers against the wood. Every click echoed through the silent boardroom like a countdown to disaster. In his right hand, he clutched a crumpled envelope. Its contents, a set of documents, threatening to derail a multi-million-dollar deal. The problem. The documents were written entirely in Basque. He slammed the papers onto the table. "If you can translate this, I'll give anyone in this room my entire month's salary." Jackson's voice was low, sharp, and tinged with mockery. "That's $200,000. Any takers?" The room went silent. No one dared move. 12 senior executives, each earning more monthly than most people made in a year, stared at him blankly. A few exchanged nervous glances. Someone cleared their throat, then quickly regretted it. Jackson leaned back in his chair, scanning the room with icy blue eyes. His expression said what his words didn't. "You're all useless." Finally, Mariana Lopez, his personal assistant, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Sir, I already called 4 translation agencies. No one's available today. And online interpreters. There's a 12-hour wait." Jackson's jaw tightened. The muscles along his cheek twitched. "We're More Global Imports," he said slowly, enunciating each word like a threat. "We move products across 6 continents and handle $40 billion in assets. But you're telling me none can translate a single piece of paper?" His voice rose. No one dared breathe. The documents weren't just any documents, but the finalized terms for a rare luxury shipment. If they missed the deadline, More Global could lose $50 million, and Jackson's ego wouldn't survive the humiliation. Then, just as he was about to dismiss the room, a quiet voice came from the back. Soft, steady, unexpected. "I can translate it." The words seemed to hang in the air, delicate, yet unshakable. Jackson turned sharply. Every executive followed their gaze toward the far corner, where a woman stood holding a mop and a small bucket of disinfectant. Her blue uniform was slightly wrinkled, her curls pulled back into a neat bun. A thin sheen of sweat clung to her forehead from working all morning, yet her posture was straight, her eyes unwavering. Nora Scott, the cleaning lady. For a moment Jackson stared, certain he'd misheard her. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, as though speaking to a child. "Did you say, can you translate this?" She nodded calmly, wiping her hands on a rag before speaking again. "Yes, these documents are written in Basque." There was a ripple of muffled laughter around the table. Someone whispered, "She's lost it." Another executive muttered, "Basque," thoughtfully, but Nora ignored them. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "May I take a look?" Jackson raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a mocking half-smile. "You expect me to believe a cleaning lady knows Basque?" "I expect you," she said softly, "to hand me the papers." Something about the quiet authority in her tone silenced the laughter. Jackson hesitated, not out of belief, but out of sheer curiosity. Slowly, he picked up the envelope, his fingers brushing against hers briefly as he handed it over. Nora's gaze didn't waver. She unfolded the documents and began reading silently, her dark eyes gliding smoothly over the unfamiliar script as though it were her mother tongue. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Finally, she looked up. "This," she said, "is a notice of inheritance. The entire room froze. A woman named Lorraine Garmendia passed away last month, Nora continued. She was your great-aunt on your mother's side. She left you a property in Bilbao, along with a substantial fortune. Jackson blinked, uncharacteristically speechless. And she added, glancing back at the document, "There's a deadline. If you don't formally accept the inheritance by 5:00 p.m. today, it gets redistributed under local law." Mariana, still pale, glanced at the clock. It's already 3:03, sir." A hush fell over the room. For once, Jackson Moore, the man who always had an answer, always had control, looked uncertain. The weight of the moment pressed down thick and unspoken. The executives whispered among themselves while Jackson dialed the Spanish consulate, his voice unusually tense. Nora waited silently, leaning casually against the conference table, as though this situation had nothing to do with her. 5 minutes later, Jackson ended the call. "Confirmed," he said grimly. "It's official." No one dared move. For the first time that morning, Jackson looked directly at Nora, really looked at her. There was no arrogance in his expression now, only something unfamiliar. Something like respect, or perhaps curiosity. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Nora," she said. "Nora Scott. How many languages do you speak, Nora?" Her reply was effortless. 6. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Jackson inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and pulled his checkbook from the inside pocket of his jacket. "Name your price," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Nora shook her head. "You already named it," she replied calmly. $200,000. The amount you promised in front of everyone." Gasps filled the room. A few jaws dropped audibly. Jackson stared at her, searching her face for any trace of irony or hesitation. He found none. Then, without another word, he signed the check and slid it across the table. Nora glanced at it once, folded it neatly, and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you," she said softly. And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving the room in complete silence. That evening, Jackson couldn't focus. He couldn't stop replaying the events in his mind, the confidence in her voice, the calm way she'd silenced a room full of executives, the casual fluency in a language most people had never even heard spoken aloud. Who was she? He poured himself a glass of scotch and stared out over the Manhattan skyline from his penthouse balcony, the city glowing like scattered diamonds beneath him. Nora Scott. A cleaning lady who knew 6 languages, a woman who saved him from losing millions, someone who somehow had made him feel small. Jackson Moore wasn't used to feeling small. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. The halls were quiet, the glass walls reflecting the soft light of dawn. He stood near the service corridor, where Nora was methodically arranging supplies in a small storage closet. She didn't notice him at first. There was something deliberate in how she moved, precise, graceful, as though every gesture had purpose. "Nora," he said finally. She turned expression unreadable. "Mr. Moore," she acknowledged politely, not pausing in her work. "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday." "I believe you already did," she said, sliding a box of cleaning cloths onto the shelf. "Not properly," he pressed. "And not enough." She paused, glancing at him briefly. "You don't owe me gratitude, Mr. Moore," she said quietly. "You owe me what you promised, and you've already paid." Her tone was calm, respectful, but final. Jackson almost smiled. She was the first person in years who'd spoken to him without fear or deference. Still, he said softer, "Now I owe you more than money." Something flickered across Nora's face for the briefest moment, maybe surprise. But then it was gone, replaced by the same measured composure. "Have a good day, Mr. Moore," she said, returning to her work. Jackson walked away that morning with a strange weight in his chest. He didn't know what it meant, but this was far from over. He didn't know about the enemies overseeing Nora. He didn't know the storm that was about to swallow them both. And he didn't know that the quiet woman with a mop and a secret past was about to change his life and heart forever. More Global Imports. Headquarters, Manhattan, New York. The city hadn't fully awakened yet. The early sunlight painted soft streaks of gold across the skyline, brushing against glass towers and pouring through the tall windows of More Global Imports. Inside the 32nd floor, the morning's hush was broken only by the distant hum of elevators and the faint murmur of voices preparing for another relentless day. But Jackson Moore was already in his office, wide awake. For the first time in years, he'd arrived before dawn. Sleep had been impossible. Jackson had tossed and turned until 3 in the morning, the sound of the city outside his penthouse blending with the noise in his head. No matter how many times he tried, he couldn't push her out of his thoughts. Nora Scott. There was a quiet confidence in her voice. She'd silenced a room full of powerful men without raising her tone. The elegant precision with which she'd read a document most professional linguists couldn't decipher. She shouldn't exist. Everything about her contradicted itself. A cleaning lady fluent in 6 languages. A woman who carried herself with calm dignity, yet tried to vanish into the background. A person who could rescue his multi-million-dollar inheritance and walk away as though it meant nothing. Jackson wasn't used to mysteries he couldn't solve, and Nora Scott was the most intriguing one he'd ever encountered. Mariana Lopez stepped into his office at 8 sharp, balancing a stack of reports. "Good morning, Mr. Moore," she said cautiously. "Morning," Jackson replied without looking up, flipping through a file he wasn't reading. Mariana hesitated before adding, "About yesterday. The cleaning lady." Jackson's eyes lifted sharply. "Nora," he corrected. Mariana blinked, surprised at his tone. "Yes, Ms. Scott," she said carefully. "Would you like me to look into her background?" He leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. He hated that the thought had crossed his mind already. "No," he said finally, his voice low. "Not yet." But of course, he wanted to know everything. He just wasn't ready to admit it, not even to himself. Later that morning, Jackson entered the global contracts meeting on the 28th floor. Representatives from Chateau Armand, a luxury wine distributor from France, had flown in to finalize a deal worth $60 million. 2 of More Global's official translators, dressed in crisp gray suits, were already seated at the table, poised with pens and tablets. Jackson nodded curtly and took his seat at the head. The negotiations began smoothly until they didn't. A French delegate asked about certification laws, rattling off a list of technical requirements in rapid French. One translator paused, frowning. The second leaned in, whispering to the first. Both looked confused. Jackson clenched his jaw. "What's the problem?" he demanded. "Sir," the senior translator replied that he was asking about ISO standards. He wants proof of compliance. Before Jackson could respond, a soft voice spoke from the far corner of the room. "No, that's not what he asked." The entire room turned. Standing near the refreshments table, balancing a tray of water glasses, was Nora Scott. Jackson stared at her, startled. "Excuse me?" he asked slowly. Nora set down the tray, walked forward, and addressed the French delegate directly in flawless Parisian French. "Monsieur Dubois," she said smoothly, "you were asking about origin traceability, not ISO compliance. You wanted details on environmental certifications and sustainability reports, correct? The French delegate's face lit up. Exactly, he exclaimed, relief washing over him. Merci, madame. The senior translator flushed crimson. Jackson, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, hiding a smile behind his hand. For the next 20 minutes, whenever the translators hesitated, Nora stepped in effortlessly, clarifying, mediating, negotiating, her voice calm and unshakable. Chateau Armand had signed the deal without hesitation when the meeting ended. The French delegates left praising Nora's rapid, enthusiastic French skills. The official translators avoided eye contact as they slipped out silently. When the room was finally empty, Jackson turned to Nora, who was gathering empty glasses from the table. You just saved a $60 million deal. He said, his voice low but measured. I did what was necessary, she replied without looking at him. 6 languages, Jackson said softly. Where did you learn them? Nora straightened slowly, meeting his gaze. For the briefest second, he thought he saw something flicker in her dark eyes. Caution, maybe, or something more profound. Life teaches you things, she said finally, if you're paying attention. And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving Jackson alone in the boardroom. By late afternoon, word had spread. In the executive lounge on the 34th floor, Ethan Colmore Global's chief financial officer sat with Sandra Park, the company's notoriously ruthless in-house attorney. She's a liability, Sandra said, flipping through a folder of employee profiles. A cleaning lady who suddenly speaks 6 languages, who negotiates million-dollar contracts. That's not just unusual, Ethan. That's dangerous. Ethan sipped his espresso slowly, his sharp gray eyes thoughtful. Jackson seems interested, he said carefully. Exactly, Sandra replied. And that's the problem. Jackson stayed late that night, long after the office had quieted. The lights of Manhattan glittered beyond the glass walls, casting a soft glow over the polished floors. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw Nora locking the supply closet, her mop propped neatly against the wall. You're still here, he said. So are you, she replied, sliding the key into her pocket. I wanted to thank you again, Jackson began, but Nora cut him off gently. Don't. You don't need to thank me. He frowned slightly, unused to being dismissed so easily. You know, he said slowly, you keep surprising me. Nora tilted her head. Why? Because I don't fit into the box you put me in. Because he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice. People like you don't just appear out of nowhere. There was a long silence. Finally, she replied softly, maybe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the dimly lit corridor, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Intrigue. And something else he wasn't ready to name. 2 nights later, Jackson found himself driving through Harlem. He didn't know precisely why he was there, only that he wanted answers. He parked across from a modest brick apartment complex and waited. At exactly 6:30, Nora emerged carrying a small backpack and holding the hand of a little boy. Noah, 7 years old, with big, curious eyes and a quiet way of observing the world. He clung to his mother's hand as she guided him carefully down the steps. Jackson watched as Nora knelt to fix Noah's jacket zipper, her gentle and patient movements. He noticed Noah avoided the bustling street sounds, covering one ear lightly as a car honked nearby. And suddenly, Jackson understood. Noah wasn't shy. He was different. He watched them walk away together, disappearing into the evening crowd, and something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. The next morning, Jackson called Mariana into his office. Run a background check on Nora Scott, he said finally. Mariana hesitated. Are you sure? Find out everything, Jackson said quietly. education, employment history, languages, where she's worked, where she's lived. Discreetly. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he needed to know who she was and why someone so extraordinary had ended up mopping his floors. 3 days later, Mariana returned with a thick sealed envelope. Jackson closed his office door before opening it. Inside was a file that didn't make sense. Nora Scott, Bachelor's in Linguistics, Columbia University. Magna Cum Laude Masters in Translation and Interpretation, Georgetown University. Former Senior Interpreter, U.S. State Department. Worked at the American Consulate in Barcelona, top-level security clearance. 2 years unaccounted for. Then 5 years ago, cleaning staff at More Global. Jackson stared at the pages, his mind refusing to process them. A former diplomatic interpreter working as a janitor. Why? That evening, Jackson found Nora in the lobby, arranging cleaning supplies. "You worked for the State Department," he said without preamble. Her hands froze briefly over the mop handle, but she didn't turn. "I used to," she said quietly. "And now you clean offices," he pressed. "Now," she said finally, meeting his gaze, "I care for my son." There was a long pause. Jackson didn't ask the question burning on his tongue, not yet. But he would, because he could feel it now as surely as the hum of the city outside Nora Scott was hiding something. Something bigger than Basque documents and wine contracts. Something that could change everything. Far above them, in the executive lounge, Ethan Cole watched the exchange from behind the tinted glass of the mezzanine railing, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Sandra Park crossed her arms. "She's becoming a problem," Sandra murmured. Ethan's lips curved into a slow, calculated smile. "Then we make her our problem." More Global Imports Headquarters. Manhattan, New York. The night skyline of Manhattan glittered like 1,000 silent witnesses. From the 32nd floor of More Global Imports, the city looked infinite, untouchable. Inside, though, tension simmered like static before a storm. The boardroom was dim, its long glass table reflecting slivers of light from the city below. Ethan Cole leaned back in his chair, expression calm, but eyes sharp as steel. Beside him, Sandra Park sat cross-legged, scrolling through an encrypted tablet. "We need to talk about Nora Scott," Sandra began, her voice clipped. Ethan nodded slightly. "She's unconventional," he said. "A cleaning staff member negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, stealing the spotlight from certified interpreters, and Jackson—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood. Richard Hayes, Chief Operating Officer, folded his hands together. "Jackson is distracted," Richard said flatly. "That's a liability." Sandra set the tablet down, her gaze cold. Then we removed the distraction. A silence followed, heavy and deliberate. Ethan spoke next, his tone deceptively light. Quietly. No drama, no noise. Richard nodded once. Agreed. The plan was simple. Officially, it would be part of a departmental restructuring outsourcing janitorial services. Nora's contract would dissolve by the end of the month. Sandra leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "And if Jackson asks questions?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. "We'll make it sound like budget efficiency. He'll have no reason to suspect otherwise." But Ethan underestimated Jackson more. He always did. Jackson found the unsigned termination papers on Mariana Lopez's desk 2 days later. "What is this?" he asked sharply, holding the document up. Mariana hesitated, caught off guard. "A restructuring proposal," she said carefully. "I thought you knew." "I don't," Jackson said, voice low, controlled. "Who authorized this?" "The board," she admitted. Jackson's jaw clenched, his chest tightening with something he didn't want to name. That evening, he stormed into Ethan's office without knocking. "Explain?" Jackson demanded, throwing the papers onto Ethan's desk. Ethan didn't even flinch. "It's standard practice," he said smoothly. "Cost optimization." "This isn't about cost. And you know it." Jackson shot back, his voice like ice. Ethan met his gaze calmly, too calmly. Jackson said evenly, "That you're letting personal feelings cloud your judgment." Jackson leaned forward, planting both palms on the desk. "You're mistaking principle for personal." A tense silence followed. Jackson's blue eyes burned, but Ethan didn't look away. "Nora stays," Jackson said finally, his voice low, lethal. "Do I make myself clear?" For the first time, Ethan's composure faltered just slightly. "Crystal," he said. Later that night, Jackson found himself wandering through the quiet corridors of Moore Global. The office lights dimmed automatically after 10, leaving soft pools of amber along the marble floors. He didn't know where he was going until he heard a familiar sound, the faint wheels squeak against tile. In the conference room, Nora was kneeling by a low cabinet, carefully stacking fresh glassware. Her uniform was simple, her hair tied back loosely, a few curls escaping to brush against her cheek. "You should be home," Jackson said quietly. She looked up, startled, but composed. "I could say the same about you," she replied softly. He stepped closer, leaning against the doorframe. "The board tried to terminate you," he said plainly. Her hands paused, fingertips resting lightly against a crystal tumbler. "I know," she said after a moment. Jackson frowned. "No, Sandra came down this morning," Nora explained calmly, standing now. "She said they're outsourcing cleaning services. My last day is at the end of the month." He waited for anger, for fear, for frustration, anything. But her face was unreadable. "And you're just accepting that?" he asked incredulously. Nora's dark eyes met his steadily. "Jackson," she said softly, "I learned a long time ago. Some battles aren't worth fighting." Silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken. Jackson slowly stepped closer, close enough to catch the faint scent of citrus and soap on her skin. "What if I told you I'd fight this one for you?" he said quietly. Nora shook her head. "Don't," she whispered. "You'd only make things worse." Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes, something fragile, something she didn't want him to see. "Why do you keep doing that?" he asked softly. "Doing what? Building walls every time someone tries to get close." Her lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Because walls keep people safe. Or they keep people lonely," Jackson countered. Her expression faltered for just a heartbeat, and then the mask slipped back into place. "Good night, Mr. Moore," she said, stepping past him. He watched her leave, her footsteps soft against the marble, and wondered what kind of storm she was carrying inside her. When Mariana knocked gently 3 days later, Jackson was in his office reviewing an investor report. "Sir," she said softly. "Nora's son, something happened." He was on his feet instantly. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air. Jackson strode down the hallway, his pace fast and controlled, but inside he was in chaos. When he reached the small room, Nora was seated by the bed, holding Noah's hand. The boy's dark curls stuck to his forehead, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Nora looked up as Jackson entered, her face pale but calm. "He fainted," she said softly, "at school. They said it was stress sensory overload." Jackson's throat tightened. He stepped closer, but didn't speak, not trusting his voice. Noah stirred, blinking up at them sleepily. "Mom," he murmured. "I'm here," Nora whispered, brushing his curls back gently. A tenderness in her voice made something shift inside Jackson's chest, an ache he couldn't name. Later, when Noah had fallen back asleep, Jackson leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You should have told me," he said softly. Nora glanced at him briefly. "Told you what? That he's special." She hesitated, then sighed, her voice quieter now. "Noah's on the spectrum," she said finally. "High-functioning autism. He struggles with noise change. A world that doesn't slow down for him." Jackson was silent for a long time. Finally, he said almost gently, "You've been carrying this alone." Her shoulders tensed, but her voice remained steady. "It's my responsibility," she said. "He's my son." "You don't have to do it alone," Jackson said quietly. She turned to face him fully now, her gaze sharp. "I do," she said, "because depending on people comes with a price." There was a finality in her voice that left no room for argument. That night, Jackson opened the thick folder Mariana had compiled. He reread Nora's credentials, flipping through each page, slowly absorbing every line. The timeline stopped making sense. A linguistics prodigy, a State Department interpreter with top-level clearance, 3 years in Barcelona at the American consulate. Then, nothing. 2 years unaccounted for. And finally, 5 years ago, she appeared at More Global. People like Nora Scott didn't just disappear unless they were running from something. 2 nights later, Jackson returned to his penthouse just after midnight. Exiting the elevator, he noticed something strange. An unmarked envelope slid under his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, signature, or explanation. Just 5 words printed in bold black ink. "Stay away from Nora Scott." Jackson stared at the note, his pulse pounding. Manhattan glittered outside his window like a promise, but something darker stirred beneath the lights. He wasn't imagining it anymore. Someone was watching her. And whoever they were, they didn't want him involved. In a quiet apartment across town, a man sat in the shadows, phone pressed to his ear. "She's resurfaced," he said, his voice low and cold. "Scott's at More Global." A pause on the other end. "Then we proceed," the voice replied. The man nodded once, eyes narrowing. The name Helios Corporation glowed faintly on his laptop screen. Manhattan, New York. More Global Imports headquarters. The city glimmered beneath a velvet night, its skyline breathing soft silver into the darkness. From the 32nd floor of More Global Imports, Jackson Moore stared out at the lights of Manhattan. But his reflection in the glass was darker than the city beyond. The note lay open on his desk, 5 black words cutting into him like shards of glass. Stay away from Nora Scott. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And it was no longer just about curiosity anymore. It was about danger. The following morning, chaos rippled through the 32nd floor. Mariana burst into Jackson's office, breathless, holding her tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." He took the tablet, frowning. On the screen was a news headline blazing in crimson font. Former state interpreter Nora Scott linked to Helios money laundering scandal. The article painted Nora as a co-conspirator in a billion-dollar corruption scheme. Photos of her from her days in Barcelona, cropped and twisted, splashed across the screen like evidence of guilt. Jackson's chest tightened. He scrolled faster, each paragraph more poisonous than the last, unverified sources claimed. Nora falsified translations to cover illegal offshore transfers. Anonymous statements implied she'd been paid to stay quiet. Helios Corporation, the company she'd exposed, publicly accused her of orchestrating the fraud. Jackson set the tablet down slowly, his jaw tightening. "Who published this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Several outlets," Mariana replied softly. It's everywhere. Blogs, financial magazines, Twitter, LinkedIn. Sir, they're coming after her. An emergency board meeting was called by noon. Jackson walked into the conference room, the atmosphere electric with tension. Ethan Cole, the CFO, was already there, pacing slowly by the panoramic windows. The company's legal counsel, Sandra Park, sat at the far end, tapping her pen like a war metronome. Richard Hayes, the COO, broke the silence first. Jackson, we need to talk about Nora. Jackson folded his arms. No, Richard. You need to talk, and I need to listen, so go ahead. Sandra leaned forward, pushing a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the same articles Mariana had shown him. This is a PR nightmare, she said coldly. Clients are calling. Investors are demanding answers. 3 contracts are on hold until we resolve the Scott situation. Jackson looked around the table, scanning each face carefully. And by resolve, he said softly, you mean fire her. No one spoke for a moment, until Ethan finally stepped forward. It's not personal, Jackson. It's risk management. Jackson's blue eyes sharpened like a blade. No, Ethan. It's cowardice dressed up as strategy. That evening, Jackson found Nora in the lobby tying the strings of a supply bag with practiced precision. Her uniform was plain, but her posture held its usual quiet dignity. Nora, he said softly. She didn't look up. I've seen it, she murmured, still focused on the knot she was tying. None of it's true, he said firmly. You know that, right? Nora finally lifted her gaze, meeting his with steady, unflinching eyes. I know the truth, Jackson, she said quietly. But the truth doesn't always matter. It matters to me. Her lips curved, faintly, bitterly. That's kind, she whispered. But this isn't your fight. He took a step closer, his voice low, insistent. It became my fight when they dragged your name through the dirt to get to me. She inhaled sharply, shaking her head slightly. You don't understand, she whispered, almost pleading. This isn't just a smear campaign. Helios. They don't forgive, and they don't forget. Later that night, Jackson left the building, only to find himself driving aimlessly through the quiet streets of Harlem. Without thinking, he stopped outside Nora's apartment. He sat there for minutes, the engine's hum low, until he saw a small figure at the window. Noah silhouetted against the pale glow of a nightlight, his small hand pressed against the glass. Jackson's chest tightened unexpectedly. Noah had nothing to do with this. He was innocent, untouched by the wars adults waged. Before Jackson could drive away, the apartment door opened, and Nora stepped out into the cold air, crossing her arms against the chill. You shouldn't be here, she said softly. I know, he admitted. I just needed to make sure you were okay. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. We're fine, she said finally, her voice gentler now. You should go. But Jackson didn't move, and for a moment neither did she. 2 days later, Jackson's penthouse received an unexpected visitor. The doorbell chimed at midnight, and when he opened the door, a tall man in a dark suit stood in the hallway holding a thin leather briefcase. Mr. Moore, the man asked. Who are you? Jackson countered. The man held up his badge, FBI. They stepped inside the city, glittering behind the glass walls, as the agent set the briefcase on the counter. My name is Agent Clark, he said calmly. We need to talk about Nora Scott. Jackson's pulse quickened. What about her? She's not who you think she is. Jackson leaned against the counter, crossing his arms tightly. Try me. The agent slid a file across the marble surface. Inside were names, dates, transaction records, a shadow network of shell companies Helios had used to move millions offshore. At the center of one key contract was Nora's signature. Jackson's brows furrowed, his voice cutting low. She didn't do this. Clark's eyes softened slightly. We know. She tried to expose them. But now, Helios is trying to rewrite history, and they're using you to get to her. Jackson's jaw tightened. Then they're going to regret it. The next morning, Jackson met Nora on the rooftop terrace of More Global, where the city stretched endlessly beneath them. The wind tangled softly through her curls as she leaned against the railing staring at the skyline. The FBI came to see me, he said. Her head whipped around sharply, her dark eyes widening for a fraction of a second before her expression settled into composure. And what did they tell you? She asked carefully. That Helios is trying to bury you, Jackson replied. And that I'm their leverage. Nora turned back toward the skyline, her grip tightening slightly on the railing. I told you this wasn't your fight, she murmured. You were wrong, Jackson said quietly. It is now. For a moment neither spoke. The hum of the city filled the silence, faint and distant. Finally, Nora said softly, Jackson, whatever this is, whatever's happening between us, it can't happen now. He stepped closer, his voice low, rough around the edges. Tell me you don't feel it. Her eyes met his, fierce and vulnerable all at once. Feeling something, she whispered, doesn't mean acting on it. Then let me act for both of us, he murmured. For a long heartbeat, she didn't move. And then gently but firmly, she stepped back. Not yet, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The following Monday, the board made their move. Ethan Cole called an emergency session without Jackson's approval. When he arrived, Sandra Park presented risk assessments to investors, painting Nora as a legal liability. This isn't about PR anymore, Sandra declared confidently. If she stays More Global, could face lawsuits, audits, and criminal investigations. Jackson slammed his hand against the table, the sound cracking like thunder. She stays, he said sharply. End of discussion. But Ethan leaned forward, his voice smooth and cold. Then you'll go down with her. That night, Nora received an anonymous text. No name, no signature, just one chilling line. Keep quiet, or Noah pays the price. Her hand trembled slightly as she read it, her breath hitching. But she made her expression calm when she glanced at Noah sitting cross-legged on the floor sketching with crayons. She deleted the message, pocketed the phone, and said nothing. Not yet. 2 days later, Jackson arrived at More Global to find chaos unfolding in the lobby. Security guards blocked reporters at the doors while employees whispered frantically. Mariana rushed to him, pale and breathless. Sir, she gasped. Nora's gone. What do you mean by gone? Jackson demanded, his voice dropping into a dangerous growl. She left. Her locker's empty. She didn't leave a note. Jackson stood frozen for a moment, the sounds of chaos blurring around him. Somewhere deep inside he knew Nora wasn't running from him. She was running from something far worse. And this time, he wouldn't let her fight it alone. Manhattan, New York. 2 weeks later. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Manhattan was slick in silver, neon lights blurring into puddles that reflected a restless city. But inside More Global Imports, the storm brewing was far darker than anything outside. Jackson Moore stood in his glass-walled office, one hand gripping the edge of his desk, the other holding his phone. He'd been calling her number for 2 days straight. No answer. Nora Scott had disappeared. He'd searched everywhere: her apartment in Harlem, the small cafe where she sometimes stopped for coffee, even Noah's school. But there was nothing. No note. No message. No explanation. It felt deliberate, like she'd erased herself. Mariana stepped into his office quietly, setting a folder on his desk. "Sir," she said gently, "I've called every hospital in the city. She isn't listed anywhere." Jackson's jaw flexed. "Keep looking," he said, his voice low, steady. "Please don't stop until we find her." Mariana hesitated, then added softly, "Ethan's been asking questions too." Jackson turned sharply. "About Nora. About her. About you." His chest tightened, and the realization settled heavy in his gut. Helios wasn't just rewriting Nora's past. They were rewriting her future. That night, Jackson sat in his penthouse Manhattan skyline, stretching endlessly beyond the rain-streaked windows. On the coffee table lay the FBI file Agent Clark had given him, pages of bank transfers, falsified contracts, and offshore accounts. At the center of it all glimmered one name, Helios Corporation. They weren't just smearing Nora. They were dismantling her life piece by piece, and Jackson suspected they'd forced her to vanish. He poured himself a scotch, but his phone buzzed before he could sip. A blocked number. He answered instantly. "Mr. Moore," a distorted male voice said calmly. "If you want Nora and the boys safe, you'll stop digging." Jackson's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles whitened. "If you touch them, then don't make us," the voice interrupted. "This isn't your war, Moore. Walk away while you still can." The line went dead. Jackson stared at his reflection in the black screen. He'd just been warned. He wasn't going to listen. The next morning, Jackson called Agent Clark. "I want complete surveillance on Helios," he said. His voice clipped. "I want to know every name, every account, every shadow." Clark hesitated. "Mr. Moore, you're not law enforcement. This isn't safe for you." "Neither is staying out of it," Jackson replied coldly. There was a pause. Then Clark sighed. "Fine. But there's something you should know. Helios is bleeding money. The investigation rattled them, but they're desperate, and desperate people make dangerous moves." Jackson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming the desk slowly. "Then it's time we make a move first." It wasn't until the fourth day that Mariana finally tracked Nora down. A private clinic on the Upper East Side, under a false name. Jackson didn't call. He went straight there. When he walked into the small, softly lit waiting room, Nora sat near the window, her curls falling loose around her shoulders. Noah sat beside her small legs, swinging sketching quietly in a notebook. She looked up and froze when she saw him. "Jackson," she whispered, her voice tight with both relief and caution. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just before her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded softly, his voice low enough not to disturb Noah. Nora closed her notebook gently and met his gaze. "Because if you were near me," she said quietly, "you'd be in danger too." "I'm already in danger," Jackson murmured. "I got a call last night." Her eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly, resting a steadying hand on Noah's shoulder. "Then you need to stay away from us," she said firmly. Jackson shook his head. "That's not happening." Later, while Noah dozed on the clinic's couch, Jackson and Nora stood by the wide hallway window overlooking the city. The silence between them was thick, almost fragile. "Why didn't you tell me they threatened Noah?" Jackson asked finally. Nora's shoulders stiffened. "Because Noah's my responsibility," she whispered. "Not yours." He studied her profile, her jawline, strength, and quiet fire in her expression. "You think you have to do this alone," he said softly. "But you don't." Her lips parted slightly like she might argue, but no words came. And for a moment, the world went quiet. The storm outside faded, replaced by her shallow breath and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Jackson stepped closer, his voice a low rasp. "I can protect you, Nora." She turned then, her dark eyes locking on his, and in them he saw fear, exhaustion, and something else she didn't dare name. But Noah stirred and mumbled softly in his sleep before either of them could speak. The spell broke. Nora turned away first. 2 nights later, chaos erupted. More Global's servers crashed just after midnight, halting contracts, locking accounts, and freezing client communications worldwide. When Jackson reached the office, Ethan Cole and Sandra Park argued with the IT director. "This isn't a system failure," the director said breathlessly. "It's a breach. Someone struck us encrypted files, rerouted communications, and stole employee data." Jackson's blood ran cold. "Employee data," he repeated slowly. The director nodded. "Including family records, addresses, and dependent information." Noah, Nora. This wasn't a random attack. This was Helios striking back. By dawn, Agent Clark had arranged protective custody. Nora and Noah were moved into a federal safe house, and Jackson insisted on being there. The apartment was modest, tucked inside an unmarked building in Brooklyn, with reinforced doors and cameras at every corner. But it wasn't the safety that unsettled Nora. It was being trapped. She stood by the window, arms folded tightly, while Jackson leaned against the opposite wall, overseeing her. She said, "Why, you don't have to be here," without looking at him. "I'm not leaving you here alone," he replied. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Jackson, this isn't your fight. It became mine the moment they threatened Noah." Noah looked up from where he sat cross-legged on the floor at the sound of his name, headphones over his ears, coloring intently. Jackson's gaze softened slightly, then returned to Nora. "You can't keep pushing me away," he said quietly. "Not anymore." She turned, then finally meeting his eyes. There was frustration there, but beneath it, something warmer, unspoken. That night, the safe house was quiet. The city noise was muffled through thick concrete walls, leaving only the soft clock ticking and the refrigerator's faint hum. Jackson was on the couch, half reading a briefing Clark had sent when Nora appeared from the hallway. She'd changed into a loose gray sweater, curls falling freely around her shoulders. "You should get some sleep," she said softly. "Can't," he replied without looking up. "I need to know what Helios is planning." She hesitated, then crossed the room, sitting on the edge of the opposite sofa. "You can't fight them like this," she murmured. "Not with force. Not with threats. You don't know how deep this goes." He finally set the papers down, turning to face her fully. "Then tell me," he said softly. "Tell me everything." For a moment she looked away, as though weighing the weight of her secrets against the risk of speaking them. Finally she whispered, "In Barcelona, I found documents Helios didn't want anyone to see. Proof they were laundering money through embassies, selling classified intel, and funding things the government couldn't trace. I tried to report it, but someone higher up shut the case down." Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied it quickly. "The threats started 2 weeks later. Anonymous calls, emails, cars are parked outside my apartment. I moved Noah 3 times before I stopped fighting and disappeared." Jackson's hands tightened into fists. "And now they've found you again," he said softly. Nora nodded once. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence holding something fragile and dangerous between them. Jackson leaned forward slightly, his voice rougher now. "You should have told me sooner," he said quietly. "I couldn't," she whispered. If I let you in, it would destroy you too. He reached out his fingertips, brushing lightly against her hand, which rested on the sofa between them. She didn't move away this time. I'm not afraid of destruction, Nora, he said softly. Her breath caught. I am, she whispered. The distance between them disappeared for a heartbeat, until Noah stirred from the other room, calling softly for her. She rose instantly, retreating into the hallway without looking back. At dawn, the sound of shattering glass woke them both. Jackson instinctively grabbed the nearest lamp, pulling Nora and Noah to the floor. Two muffled pops followed suppressed gunfire, hitting the reinforced windows. Agent Clark burst through the door seconds later, weapon drawn. They found us, he said sharply. We need to move now. Jackson wrapped one arm around Noah, gripping Nora's hand with the other, pulling her to her feet. Somewhere below, tires screeched and voices shouted in a language Jackson didn't recognize. Helios had stopped playing games. The war had arrived at their doorstep. Brooklyn, New York Federal Safe House, 48 hours after the attack. The city beyond the reinforced windows never slept. But inside the safe house, time had its own rhythm, slower, heavier, as if every tick of the clock carried the weight of survival. The safe house was meant to be invisible, a place where danger could not seep in. Yet Jackson Moore knew better. Danger wasn't outside anymore. It was everywhere. The air was thick with tension. The glass from the broken window had been cleared, the bullet holes plastered over, but the silence that lingered in the safe house was louder than any explosion. Nora Scott sat on the sofa, one hand resting on Noah's shoulder as he traced shapes on his tablet with perfect concentration, headphones muffling the chaos beyond his small world. She'd grown used to his quiet, his refuge. But tonight, she noticed his fingers tapping too quickly, his breathing too shallow. Jackson leaned against the far wall, arms folded, eyes fixed on the city outside. He hadn't spoken much since the attack. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than words. Finally, Agent Clark broke it. We can't stay here, he said, voice clipped. Helios has the location. If they found you once, they'll see you again. Nora's gaze flicked up. Then where? She asked softly. Clark hesitated, glancing at Jackson. D.C. We move you tonight. Higher clearance facility. Tighter security. Jackson shook his head. And you think Helios doesn't have eyes there too? Clark's jaw tightened. It's better than sitting here waiting for them to come back. Jackson didn't reply, but his hand curled into a fist against the windowsill. Later, when the agents retreated to finalize plans, Nora walked into the kitchen to make tea. The overhead light cast soft shadows against the counter as she reached for two mugs, one for herself, one for Jackson. It had become a quiet ritual between them. She didn't hear him approach until his voice brushed low behind her. You shouldn't be this calm, he murmured. She froze, then turned slowly. I'm not, she said softly. I hide it better. His gaze held hers, intense and unreadable. You don't have to hide from me, he said quietly. Something unspoken flickered in her expression, but she didn't answer. Instead, she slid one mug toward him. Drink, she said. Jackson accepted it but didn't move away. His presence was close, deliberate, like gravity pulling at something she wasn't ready to surrender. They sat silently at the small kitchen table, steam curling from their mugs. Finally, Jackson spoke. You disappeared once before, he said, voice even. And now you're ready to do it again. Her fingers tightened around the porcelain, but she didn't look up. It's what keeps Noah safe, she whispered. And what about you? He asked. Her lips curved into the faintest, bitterest smile. Me, she said softly. I stopped mattering a long time ago. Jackson set his mug down carefully, leaning forward. Not to me, he said. The words hung between them, fragile and heavy at once, and she couldn't breathe for a moment. That night, Clark brought news, and it wasn't good. Clark said, "We've identified one of the Helios operatives leading the New York attacks, setting a file on the table. Codename Hawthorne." Jackson flipped the folder open, scanning the grainy photograph inside a man in his mid-40s. Sharp features, cold eyes. "What's his connection to Nora?" Jackson asked. Clark hesitated. "Barcelona," he said finally. 5 years ago. He was part of the operation Helios ran out of the American consulate. Nora stilled her breath, catching for just a second. She didn't have to look at the photo to know who it was. "He warned me," she whispered. Jackson turned sharply. "Warned you?" She nodded slowly. "Back then, before I left Spain, Hawthorne came to me, told me if I kept pushing the investigation, Noah and I would vanish without a trace." Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled on the table. "You never told anyone," Jackson said quietly. "Who was I supposed to tell?" she whispered. The people running the investigation were the same people Helios owned. That revelation changed everything. Jackson found himself pacing the living room, unable to sit still. Every piece of this puzzle made the picture worse. Helios wasn't just mighty, they were untouchable. And Nora had been carrying this alone for 5 years. When she came to check on him, he turned too quickly, nearly colliding with her. He said, "You should have told me sooner," frustration threading his voice. "I couldn't," she replied softly. "You can't fight something you don't understand." "Then teach me," he said, stepping closer. "Show me everything you know, every document, every detail. No more secrets, Nora." Her dark eyes held his, searching for something, maybe a promise he hadn't spoken yet. Finally, she nodded once. "Tomorrow," she whispered. That night, Jackson found Noah sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing elaborate spirals across his sketchpad. "Hey, buddy," Jackson said softly, crouching down beside him. "What are you working on?" Noah didn't answer immediately. His brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he turned the sketchpad into a maze of circles and lines. "It's the city," Noah murmured, "but upside down." Jackson glanced at Nora standing nearby, her expression gentle but protective. "He has a way of seeing patterns," she explained softly. "Numbers, shapes, systems. He maps them without meaning to." Jackson looked back at Noah, tracing one of the intricate lines with his fingertip. "That's a gift," he said quietly. Noah shrugged lightly, as though unsure how to carry its weight. And Jackson realized in that moment how much Helios could take from them and how much he'd risk to stop them. By morning, Clark had confirmation. Helios had moved its primary operation to a warehouse on the Hudson. Surveillance photos showed armored vans, encrypted satellite feeds, and heavily armed security. "They're preparing for an extraction," Clark said grimly. "If they leave U.S. jurisdiction, they vanish for good." Jackson leaned over the table, scanning the grainy images. "Then we stop them," he said flatly. Nora crossed her arms. "It's not that simple," she said softly. "If Hawthorne's running point, this isn't an extraction. It's bait." Clark nodded slowly. "She's right. They want to draw us out." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Then we set a trap of our own." That night, unable to sleep, Nora stepped out onto the small balcony of the safe house. The city stretched endlessly beneath her, lights flickering like stars scattered across the ground. Jackson found her leaning against the railing, curls spilling over her shoulders. "You should be resting," he murmured. "So should you," she replied softly. He moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers lightly. Neither of them spoke for a long time, letting the hum of the city fill the silence. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know how this ends." He turned to look at her, his voice low but steady. "It ends with you safe," he said. "Both of you." She shook her head faintly. "Nothing about us has ever been safe." Her words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. He slowly reached out, his fingers grazing hers where they rested against the railing. She didn't pull away this time. "Then we make it safe," he said softly. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The air between them felt charged, delicate, on the edge of something inevitable. Jackson leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you don't feel this." Nora's breath caught her lashes lowering. Feeling it, she murmured, "Doesn't make it right." "Right doesn't matter," he countered. Her hand trembled where it rested beneath his. But as their lips almost met, Noah's soft voice called from inside. "Mom." The spell broke instantly. Nora stepped back, inhaling deeply, her composure sliding back into place like armor. At dawn, Clark burst into the safe house, face pale, voice clipped. "They found us again," he said sharply. "Helios just breached federal servers. We need to move now." Jackson grabbed the go bag, pulling Nora and Noah close. "Where?" he demanded. Clark hesitated. "Washington. Top-tier clearance. It's the only place left." Nora's hand tightened around Noah's as she glanced back at Jackson. There was no protest in her voice for the first time, only quiet certainty. "Wherever we go," she whispered, "they'll follow." Jackson met her gaze, his voice low, confident. "Then we stop running." And this time, she didn't argue. Washington, D.C., Federal Relocation Facility, 5 days later. The relocation safe house was unlike the one in Brooklyn, larger, quieter, with walls lined in steel and silence so deep it pressed against the skin. The FBI called it Tier 1 security, but Nora Scott knew better. Helios had broken through barriers before, and she feared they would again. The muted hum of the HVAC filled the dim hallway as Nora stood barefoot near the window, her curls damp from a late shower, a loose sweater clinging softly to her frame. Outside, the Potomac shimmered under a velvet sky, the Capitol dome glowing faintly in the distance, serene, deceptive, as if danger wasn't shadowing their every step. Jackson Moore leaned against the doorway, arms folded, his tall frame silhouetted by the hallway light. He watched her without speaking, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You haven't slept," he said, his voice deep and low. Nora glanced over her shoulder, but didn't turn fully. "Neither have you," she countered softly. He exhaled slowly, stepping into the room, stopping just short of where the moonlight painted her silhouette. "I keep thinking," he murmured, "how they found us twice. How many more times before?" His voice trailed, but she heard the unsaid words anyway. "Before we don't get away," she finished quietly. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and taut, like an invisible thread pulling them closer than either intended. By morning, Agent Clark summoned them both to the briefing room. The large glass board was covered in Helios intel, and red pins marked cities across 3 continents. Clark said, "We've traced a new pattern, sliding photographs across the table. Helios isn't just targeting Nora. They're dismantling more global from the inside." Jackson scanned the images, his jaw tightening. "My board suspected this," he said softly. "But I didn't think they'd move this fast." Clark met his gaze evenly. "There's more," he said. "We've identified a mole inside your company." Nora straightened in her chair, her dark eyes sharp. "Who?" she asked quietly. Clark hesitated, then turned a single photo face up on the table. "Sandra Park." Jackson froze. "No," he said, softly shaking his head. Sandra's been with me for 8 years. She handled my father's estate. She's been leaking your schedule's financials and even internal security codes. Clark interrupted gently. She was bought 2 years ago. Helios owns her now. The silence that followed was thick and bitter. Jackson said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw ticked sharply as he stared at the photo. Betrayal had never tasted this sharp. That evening, the secure facility alarms blared 2 long, sharp wails that pulled everyone instantly to high alert. Jackson grabbed Noah instinctively, pressing him close against his chest, while Nora hurriedly swept the boy's sketchbook and headphones into a bag. Clark's voice barked through the intercom. Stay in the south corridor. Helios breached the outer perimeter, 2 agents down. Nora froze mid-step, her breath shallow. Jackson placed a steadying hand on her lower back, guiding her quickly toward the reinforced panic room. Eyes on me, he murmured. Not them. We're okay. But when the metallic doors sealed behind them, Nora realized okay was slipping further and further away. Inside the panic room, the space was tight, dim. Overhead light, cold steel walls, a low hum of ventilation. Nora sat with Noah curled against her side, her hand stroking his curls softly to keep him grounded. Jackson leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed his sharp suit, rumpled from hours of chaos. His gaze found hers in the dim light, and something in it, something silent, steady, held her together when everything else threatened to fall apart. Minutes turned into hours, but no one spoke. Only the sound of Noah's soft breath filled the silence. Finally, when the lockdown lifted, Clark opened the door. It was a probe, he said grimly. Testing our response times. They're learning. Jackson's hand brushed Nora's shoulder as they stepped out, steady and grounding, though he said nothing. She didn't move away. Later that night, after Noah had fallen asleep, Nora wandered into the common area to find Jackson sitting on the floor, back against the wall, a glass of untouched whiskey resting beside him. You're awake, she murmured. Couldn't sleep, he replied, his voice rough from exhaustion. Sandra. Her heart clenched at the quiet devastation layered in his tone. She sat across from him, curling her knees beneath her sweater. Betrayal feels like silence, she said softly, until it screams loud enough to destroy you. Jackson's blue eyes lifted to hers, searching, unguarded. I trusted her, he admitted, his voice breaking subtly around the edges. And you'll survive her, she replied, her words like soft steel. You always do. The next morning brought a new storm. Clark intercepted a coded message Helios had sent an ultimatum. They want you, Nora Clark said bluntly, sliding the decrypted message toward her. In exchange, they'll leave more global intact. Jackson slammed a fist against the table. They expect me to believe that. Clark shook his head. They don't care if you believe it. They want leverage. Nora stared at the message silently, her fingertips tightening around the edge of the paper until it crumpled. If giving myself up ends this, she began softly. Absolutely not. Jackson interrupted sharply, his voice low and lethal. Don't finish that sentence. Her eyes flicked up to his, meeting a storm she hadn't expected. Jackson. No, he said, leaning closer. I've already watched them try to ruin you once. I'm not letting them take you. That evening, while Clark briefed his agents, Jackson found Nora alone on the terrace, the night wind lifting loose strands of her hair. You keep putting yourself between me and them, she said softly without turning. And I'll keep doing it, he replied quietly, stepping closer. Why? She whispered, finally meeting his gaze. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and then softly, deliberately, he said, Because I stopped knowing the difference between protecting you and wanting you safe. Her breath caught. Jackson. He reached out slowly, fingertips grazing hers where they rested against the cold railing. Tell me to stop, he murmured. But she didn't. The silence between them stretched fragile and charged. He leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her temple. You terrify me, she whispered. Why? He asked softly. Because I've spent 5 years building walls, she said, voice trembling. And you don't even see them. He smiled faintly bittersweet. That's because I'm too busy breaking them. For a heartbeat, it felt like gravity itself shifted, drawing them closer, until the sharp slam of a door broke the moment. Clark appeared, his expression grim. Sandra's vanished, Clark announced. Packed her office, cut her phone, left everything behind. We think she's on the move to Helios headquarters in Zurich. Jackson cursed under his breath, already reaching for his jacket. I'm going after her, he said. Clark grabbed his arm. Absolutely not. This isn't a corporate negotiation. It's espionage on foreign soil. You leave U.S. jurisdiction and I can't protect you. Jackson glanced at Nora, his jaw set. Then we don't ask for protection, he said quietly. We make our own. That night, as the facility settled into uneasy quiet, Nora tucked Noah into bed and lingered at the doorway longer than usual, watching his small chest rise and fall steadily. She felt Jackson's presence behind her before she heard him. He's safe, Jackson said softly. For now, she whispered. They stood there in silence, two souls on the edge of something neither could name, bound by danger secrets, and everything left unsaid. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of sirens through the dark. Inside, something shifted between them, unspoken but undeniable. And in Zurich, Sandra Park stepped off a private jet, her phone pressed to her ear. I have what you want, she told the voice on the other end. And I'm ready to trade. Helios had made their next move, but this time, Jackson Moore was ready to play their game. Zurich, Switzerland. 2 weeks later. The first snow had begun to fall, fine white flakes swirling beneath the muted glow of the street lamps. Zurich was hushed beneath winter's breath, the city's quiet elegance hiding the danger that simmered beneath its polished surface. Jackson Moore stood near the window of their temporary hideout, hands buried in his coat pockets, blue eyes reflecting the frozen river beyond. Beside him, Nora Scott leaned against the frame, her curls brushing the soft wool of her scarf, dark eyes tracing the path of lights across the Limit River. They shouldn't have been here. But Sandra Park was in Zurich, and Helios was preparing their next strike. The small apartment Clark had secured for them was cold despite the roaring heater. Its walls were bare, its furniture sparse, but it overlooked the quiet alleyways leading into the heart of Zurich's financial district, Helios's playground. Jackson sipped from his mug, eyes never leaving the glass. Zurich feels too calm, he murmured. Nora wrapped her sweater tighter around herself. That's what scares me, she replied softly. The silence stretched, broken only when Jackson turned his voice low, but edged with something sharp. Sandra's here, he said. She has what Helios wants, but I doubt she's trading it for free. Nora met his gaze steady, despite the weight behind his words. Then we need to find her first. He studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing how much to protect her versus how much to trust her. Finally, he nodded. The following morning, Clark laid out the surveillance photos on the small kitchen table, the lamplight casting long shadows across them. Clark said that Sandra was using a Helios-controlled banker and pointing to a tall glass tower near the Paradeplatz. Codename Stiller Bank. If she meets them, we'll lose the chance to intercept. Jackson's jaw tightened. We're not losing her, he said. Clark hesitated, glancing toward Nora. Helios has local operatives here. If they make you, there's no federal backup. This is a foreign jurisdiction more. If something goes wrong, it won't. Jackson cut in his voice, calm, clipped. Watching the map, Nora traced one finger over the side streets, branching away from the Bahnhofstrasse. Helios always uses diversions, she murmured thoughtfully. Their extraction won't be through the front if Sandra meets them here. Clark paused, then smiled faintly. You're thinking like them, he said quietly. I spent years running from them, Nora replied, her voice steady. I learned. By nightfall, the plan was in motion. Clark's agents scattered through Zurich's narrow alleys, while Jackson and Nora positioned themselves near the rear entrance of the Stiller Bank building, hidden behind a line of parked delivery vans. Snow fell harder now, soft flakes clinging to Nora's lashes as she pulled her scarf tighter. Jackson noticed, but said nothing, though his hand lingered near the small of her back, protective without being obvious. Through his earpiece, Clark's voice crackled softly. Sandra's on the move. 10 meters from the entry. Confirm visual. Jackson's gaze sharpened as a familiar figure emerged. Sandra Park, her dark coat drawn tight, her step purposeful, flanked by 2 men in gray wool. Confirmed, Jackson murmured. She's not alone. Neither are they, Clark replied. 3 Helios operatives inside. Stay sharp. Nora's pulse quickened as Sandra disappeared into the glass doors. Inside the bank, the transaction was already underway. From their vantage point across the street, Jackson and Nora watched Sandra slip a slim black drive across the polished counter into the banker's waiting hands. Clark's voice was steady but urgent. Not yet, he warned through comms. If you move too soon, we spook them. We need the full transfer to trace their accounts. But Jackson's patience was wearing thin. Nora noticed it in the tense line of his jaw, the subtle shift of weight on his feet. She reached out instinctively, her hand brushing his sleeve. Wait, she whispered. He glanced down, met her eyes, and for a moment her calm steadied him. Then everything unraveled at once. 2 masked Helios operatives stormed the lobby, weapons drawn. Sandra screamed, dropping the drive as the banker dove for cover. Move! Clark barked in their ears. Jackson grabbed Nora's hand, pulling her into motion as chaos erupted. Clark's agents engaged Helios security inside, while Sandra bolted out a side door, clutching the drive. They chased her through the labyrinthine streets of Zurich's Altstadt, the cobblestones slick beneath their boots, breath clouding in the freezing air. Sandra Jackson called sharply, "Stop!" But she didn't. She ran harder, weaving through alleys, ducking beneath stone archways, her silhouette vanishing and reappearing in the dark. Finally, they cornered her near the riverbank, the limit flowing black and cold beneath the moonlight. Sandra turned, chest-heaving eyes wild. "You shouldn't be here, Jackson," she gasped. "You don't understand what Helios is capable of." He stepped forward slowly, steady as ice. "Then make me understand," he said softly. Her laughter was sharp, almost broken. "You think I wanted this?" she whispered. "Helios owns me, Jackson. They always have. They bought my debts, buried my family, and left me with one choice: betray you, or watch them disappear my sister." Nora stepped forward, her voice quiet but unyielding. "And you gave them everything," she said softly. "Every code, every weakness." Sandra's gaze met hers, wet with guilt. "I could control it," Sandra whispered. "But they want more now. That drive. It's a kill switch, Nora. Names, accounts, safe houses, every person they've ever bought." Jackson's expression hardened. "Then we take it," he said flatly. But before Sandra could respond, the sharp crack of a rifle split the night. She staggered, clutching her shoulder, the drive clattering to the ground. Sniper Clark yelled over comms. Jackson dragged Nora into cover as Clark's agents returned fire from across the street. The alley lit with muzzle flashes, the cold air sharp with smoke and adrenaline. "They're hurting us," Nora realized breathlessly toward the river. Jackson's jaw clenched. "Then we go the other way," he growled, grabbing her hand. Together, they dove down a side passage, their footsteps echoing against stone walls as shouts rang behind them. Jackson shielded her as they slipped into the shadow of an abandoned cafe, Noah's name like a prayer unspoken between them. "Stay low," he whispered, his breath ragged. "I won't let them near you." For a heartbeat, Nora met his gaze, saw the promise there, the danger, and something more profound that terrified her more than Helios ever could. They hid in the cafe's storage room, their backs pressed against the cold brick breaths coming hard and fast. The muffled chaos outside faded to a low hum, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat roaring in her ears. Jackson's hand still held hers firm and grounding. She realized she hadn't let go either. "You could have been killed tonight," she whispered. "So could you," he replied, his voice rough. "I'd rather it be me." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes, despite the steel in her voice. "Please, don't say that," she breathed. "Don't make promises like that." His thumb brushed against her knuckles, deliberate, gentle. "I only make promises I intend to keep," he murmured. For a moment, the world stopped, the cold, the danger, the weight of every unsaid word. Her breath trembled as his fingertips traced the line of her jaw, lingering, hesitant, yet unrelenting. "Jackson," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Tell me to stop," he said softly. But she didn't. And when his lips brushed hers, it wasn't desperation, it was inevitability, a quiet surrender beneath the chaos. Then, as if the universe conspired to pull them back, Clark's voice tore through the comms. "They have the drive," he snapped. "Helios has it." The moment shattered. They pulled apart, breathless reality slamming back between them. By dawn, Sandra was in a federal custody, her shoulder wound stabilized, but the drive and the names it held were gone. Clark slammed his fist against the table. "Helios knows we're here," he growled. "And now they know we're coming for them." Jackson stood silent by the window, snow still falling beyond the glass, his reflection carved in sharp lines of exhaustion and resolve. Nora approached softly, standing beside him without speaking. They just watched the city waking beneath the pale morning light for a long moment. Finally, Jackson turned, his voice low, steady, unshakable. "This isn't about survival anymore," he said. "It's war." Nora's dark eyes met his, the weight of everything unspoken settling between them. "Then we finish it," she whispered. Milan, Italy, 3 weeks later. The city burned gold beneath the setting sun, its streets alive with the soft hum of scooters and the murmur of conversations spilling from cafes. But beneath Milan's warmth and elegance lay shadows darker than any nightfall. Nora Scott adjusted her scarf against the cool breeze, her curls brushing across her cheek as she followed Jackson Moore through the narrow stone alleyways. Their steps echoed faintly against ancient walls, blending with the distant toll of cathedral bells. Helios's private compound was here, hidden behind a facade of abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of the Navigli district. And tonight, they would breach it. The air tasted of espresso and rain-soaked pavement as Nora and Jackson moved through the quiet streets. Every detail of the mission had been rehearsed. Clark's agents would infiltrate from the west, Jackson and Nora from the south entrance, meeting inside Helios's server wing. And yet, As Nora glanced up at the ochre-colored balconies, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Jackson noticed. "Relax." He murmured, his voice deep and low. "You're safe with me." Her lips curved faintly despite the weight pressing against her chest. "I'm not worried about me," she whispered. He slowed just enough to meet her gaze. "Then worry about them," he said softly, nodding toward the compound, rising in the distance, 4 stories of stone, steel, and secrets. Inside the safe house hours earlier, Clark had briefed them one last time, his tone clipped and sharp. He said, "This is Helios's European Nerve Center, laying blueprints across the table. Encrypted servers, private security, underground access points. But if we get in, we'll find what we need: the location of the Zurich Drive and a list of Helios's investors." Nora leaned over the map finger, tracing the narrow service tunnels beneath the compound. "They'll expect us at the main gate," she murmured, "so we don't give them what they desire." Clark nodded. "South entrance." He agreed. 2 minutes of open ground, then blind spots to the server wing. Jackson rested one hand on the table, his blue eyes steady. "And if they see us," Clark's silence was answer enough. By nightfall, the streets near the compound were empty shadows stretching long beneath flickering streetlights. Jackson crouched low behind a delivery truck, his hand resting lightly on Nora's back, as they waited for Clark's signal. "On my mark," Clark whispered through comms. A green light blinked twice on Jackson's earpiece. They moved. The south wall rose before them, cold steel, glinting faintly beneath the security floodlights. Jackson hoisted Nora first, steadying her as she scaled the metal grate. Her boots scraped softly against the wall before she dropped silently onto the other side. He landed beside her momentarily, breath ghosting faintly in the cold night air. "Stay close," he murmured. She didn't need telling. They reached the server wing without incident too easily. Nora felt it before she saw the stillness, the absence of guards, the faint hum of machinery that seemed louder than it should have been. Jackson swiped the stolen clearance badge across the access panel. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Nora frowned. "That's impossible," she whispered. Clark said this would. The overhead lights exploded into blinding white. A dozen Helios operatives stepped from the shadows, weapons drawn. "Welcome home," a voice said behind them. "Sandra Park." She stood flanked by 2 guards, her wounded shoulder bandaged, but her expression calm, too calm. Sandra, Jackson said coldly, his voice low. "You set us up." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Nora, regret flashing for just a heartbeat. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. Gunfire erupted. Jackson pulled Nora behind a pillar, shielding her body with his, as Clark's agents stormed in from the west corridor, trading fire with Helios's men. "This way," Clark shouted, gesturing toward a narrow stairwell. Nora grabbed Jackson's hand, pulling him toward the shadows, as Sandra's voice echoed through the chaos. "Jackson, don't!" she cried. "You don't know what they'll do if you take her." But he didn't stop. They slipped into the stairwell, just as the lights cut out, plunging the corridor into darkness. Nora's breath came fast, her hand still tangled in his. "They knew we'd come," she whispered. "Then we use that," he murmured back. "Let them think we're running blind." The stairwell led them to an underground corridor lined with stone walls damp from years of disuse. Nora's flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across faded Helios insignias etched into the cement. Jackson stopped suddenly, pressing a finger to his lips. Ahead, faint voices murmured, 2 guards standing near a heavy steel door. Nora crouched low, pressing against the wall as Jackson crept closer. He moved like a shadow, silent, precise, knocking one man unconscious before the second could even draw his weapon. The steel door groaned open, revealing a chamber humming with blue light. Racks of servers lined the walls, each labeled in Helios's code. Nora's breath caught. "This is it," she whispered. She hurried to the nearest console, fingers flying over the encrypted interface. Jackson stood beside her, watching the feed of live camera footage, operatives swarming upstairs. "They locked the main drives," she muttered. "I need a key." Jackson frowned. "What kind of key?" Her lips parted slowly, realization dawning. "Noah," she whispered. "It's his algorithm." Months ago, before Barcelona Helios had experimented with a cognitive mapping code, a model Noah had unknowingly mirrored in his sketches. Without him, the system was uncrackable. "We need him," she breathed. Jackson shook his head sharply. "He stays out of this." But when Clark's urgent voice crackled through the comms, "We're surrounded. Extract now, or lose everything," they both knew there was no choice. Before leaving the chamber, Nora paused, leaning back against the cold steel rack, her breathing unsteady. Jackson turned, his shadow falling over her. "You're shaking," he said softly. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice trembled. He stepped closer, his fingertips brushing against the edge of her sleeve. "You don't have to be," he murmured. Her dark eyes lifted to his, the hum of the servers filling the silence between them. For a moment, the chaos outside faded, leaving only this fragile space, this impossible tension, pulling them closer than reason allowed. "Jackson." She breathed his name, breaking softly on her lips. "I've got you," he said. They escaped through the southern tunnels, snow falling softly when they surfaced near the Navigli Canal. Clark was already there, panting hard, his weapon drawn. "We can't hold Milan," he said quickly. "We regroup in Geneva." "But more." He hesitated, his gaze shifting uneasily toward Nora. "Helios isn't after the drive anymore." Jackson stiffened. "Then what?" Clark's jaw tightened. "They want her." Nora's breath stilled, cold air burning her lungs. "Why?" she whispered. Clark hesitated, then said quietly, "Because she's the only person alive who knows the real name of Helios's founder." That night, in their rented flat above the quiet canals, Nora stood barefoot by the window, watching the snow melt against the dark water below. Jackson leaned against the wall behind her, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his silence louder than any words. "It never ends," she whispered, her reflection pale against the glass. "It will," he said, his voice low. "Certain." She turned, then, her gaze meeting his. "And when it does?" He hesitated, stepping closer until he stood just a breath away. His hand lifted, slow, deliberate, brushing a stray curl from her face. "Then we decide what happens next," he murmured. For a moment, neither moved. The world outside carried on, the soft splash of water, the distant toll of bells, the muted hum of life, but inside time narrowed to the inches between them. And as the snow fell heavier against the glass, neither could deny the truth anymore. This wasn't just survival. This was something more profound, fiercer, and far more dangerous. Far away, in a glass tower overlooking Lake Geneva, a woman stood at the edge of a boardroom table, her face hidden by shadow. "Bring her to me," the woman ordered quietly. "Alive." Helios's game was far from over, but Jackson Moore was done playing by their rules. Geneva, Switzerland, 1 week later. The city glittered like spilled starlight against the black velvet of Lake Geneva, its surface reflecting the 1,000 tiny flames of the skyline. Yet the beauty of the town felt distant, almost cruel, because tonight wasn't about its elegance. Tonight was about survival, and choices, and love. Nora Scott stood barefoot at the window, in the top-floor suite of a secure federal facility, arms folded tightly across her chest. Beyond the glass, the faint hum of the city played beneath the snow-heavy clouds, yet her thoughts were a storm she couldn't quiet. Jackson Moore leaned against the opposite wall, his tall frame silhouetted by the soft amber glow of the lamplight, his blue eyes fixed on her steady searching, holding more questions than they had answers for. Agent Clark placed a thin black folder on the table, his face drawn, his voice low. "We found the founder," he said, breaking the silence. Nora turned slowly, tension crawling up her spine. "Who?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Clark hesitated, his gaze flicking between her and Jackson. "Amelia Hart." The name hung in the air, sharp and brittle. Nora's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." Jackson frowned, stepping closer. "Who is she?" Nora pressed a hand against the cold glass, grounding herself before speaking. "She was my mentor," she said softly, "at Barcelona. The woman who taught me everything about decoding Helios's data streams. She saved me, Jackson." Clark's jaw clenched. "And now she's the one trying to destroy you." An encrypted message arrived that night and was delivered on an untraceable channel, the sender, Amelia Hart. "Come to me, Nora. Alone. Bring the boy. Or watch the world burn." Jackson's fist clenched at his side as he read the words over her shoulder. "Absolutely not," he said sharply. "She wants you as bait." Nora's dark eyes rose to meet his steady, despite the tremor in her voice. "She doesn't want me," she said softly. "She wants Noah." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Outside, the city kept breathing, unaware of the storm about to break above it. Geneva's federal compound was secure, but Nora's sleep wasn't. That night, her dreams replayed Barcelona in fragments, the humid air. Amelia's voice whispering algorithms in her ear, the day she disappeared and left Nora with secrets too dangerous to hold. When she woke, she found Jackson still awake, seated by the window, lit by the ghostly pale moonlight. "You're not resting," she murmured, pulling her sweater around her shoulders. "Neither are you," he replied quietly, gaze never leaving the lake. She stepped closer, close enough to see the tension coiled in his jaw, the storm behind his calm. "Talk to me," she whispered. He finally turned, his voice low, almost fragile. "I can't lose either of you," he said. The next morning, the arguments began. Clark wanted to move Noah to a secure location deep in the Alps, far from Geneva and Helios. Jackson refused. "We're stronger together," he said firmly. "Helios won't expect us to stand our ground." Nora's gaze shifted between them, her voice quiet but cutting. "Helios expects everything," she said. "That's what makes them dangerous." Clark slammed his palm against the table. "This isn't a negotiation, Moore. If Amelia gets her hands on Noah's algorithm, we won't have a safe place left." The room fell silent, but Nora could feel Jackson's frustration like static. He left without a word, and she didn't follow, though every part of her wanted to. That evening, Geneva felt too still, the lake too calm, the streets outside too silent. Nora sat curled on the sofa, Noah asleep against her side, his sketchbook resting lightly across his chest. Jackson appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching them. "You should sleep," she whispered. "I can't," he admitted softly. She met his gaze, and for a moment the walls between them felt thinner than ever. "When this ends," she murmured, "do you think there'll be a life?" After Jackson hesitated before answering. "If there isn't," he said, his voice low, steady, "I'll build one. For you. For him." Her breath trembled, but she didn't look away. Something passed between them, then quiet and unspoken, a promise neither dared put into words. At dawn, Helios made their move. Clark intercepted Amelia's coordinates, a private glass tower disguised as an investment firm overlooking the lake. "This is it," Clark said, strapping on his holster. "Either we end Helios or they end us." Jackson glanced at Nora, his voice low. "You're staying here." She shook her head instantly. "I'm the only one who understands Amelia's codes. You'll need me." His jaw tightened. "Nora," she said firmly, "if you go without me stepping closer," until her voice softened, "you won't make it past the first firewall." And he couldn't argue with that. The glass tower loomed like a monument to secrets, its mirrored facade reflecting the pale gray of the winter sky. Inside, the lobby was silent. Empty too. Empty. They reached the top floor without resistance, but Nora froze when the door slid open. Amelia Hart stood at the far end of the room, silhouetted against the panoramic view of Lake Geneva. She turned slowly, her expression calm, almost tender. "Nora," she said softly. "You came." Nora's voice trembled despite her strength. "Why?" she whispered. "Why Helios? Why all of this?" Amelia smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Because control," she said, "is the only way to keep the world from tearing itself apart." Jackson stepped forward, his voice low, sharp. "You built a network of chaos and called it control." Amelia's gaze shifted to him, assessing, calculating. "And you," she said softly, "are standing in my way." Security poured into the room, Helios operatives flanking Amelia as Clark's agents stormed from the opposite entrance. Gunfire erupted, shattering glass and drowning the room in chaos. Jackson pulled Nora behind an overturned desk, shielding her as fragments rained around them. "Stay down," he barked over the noise. "The servers," she shouted back. "We need them intact." He glanced at her, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Or we need you alive," he countered sharply. But she was already moving, crawling low toward the access panel beneath the central console, her fingers flying over the code she'd once helped Amelia write. Smoke filled the air as the firefight dragged on, shouts and ricochets echoing against steel and glass. Jackson reached her side, just as the system unlocked with a soft electronic chime. "We have the files," she breathed. "Every name, every account. Helios is finished." Before she could rise, Jackson's hand caught hers, pulling her back against the cover of his chest. "Not finished," he whispered near her ear. "Not yet." Their faces were inches apart, breaths mingling, adrenaline burning through their veins. The truth between them sharpened into something undeniable in the chaos and danger. "Jackson," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've got you," he said. And for the first time, she believed him. By nightfall, Helios's servers were destroyed. Amelia had escaped into the dark, and Geneva burned with unanswered questions. But for the first time in years, Nora felt something unexpected: hope. Standing on the balcony of the safe house, she watched the lake glimmer beneath the pale moonlight. Jackson joined her quietly, resting his hand lightly against the railing beside hers. "It's not over," he said softly. "No," she whispered, "but maybe it's beginning." He turned to her, then the wind carrying the faint scent of snow and city smoke, his voice low and certain. "Wherever this leads," he said, "I'm not letting go." Nora's gaze lifted to his, steady and unguarded. "Then don't," she breathed. And in the silence that followed, Geneva's night held its breath with them, as though the world knew this was only the start.